What a great morning we've had so far. My head, as I mentioned before, seems really, really full of community, full of ideas, full of thoughts, and how we're going to move forward for some of these solutions. But, you know, a panel discussion seems like a perfect way for all of us to dig a little bit deeper into, you know, some of these. I'm messing. Sorry. It just seems appropriate way for us to dig deep in with some of our community members and experts. I'm just going to say, this is going to be a very casual conversation. We're going to dig deep from some of the things we learned this morning and some more, you know, in those areas we want to speak to a little bit further. So settle in for a great conversation. And, yeah, go.
Yeah, so you already know two of the panelists that we have here, but I will introduce our two key researchers from the Be Well Work Well project. So we have Leith Deacon here. He's the Associate Professor in Rural Planning and Development in the School of Environment and Design and Rural Development at the University of Guelph. As Gwen mentioned, he's also the Chair of Rural Resiliency at Gateway Centre of Excellence in Rural Health. Leith is a full member of the Canadian Institute of Planners and a registered professional planner. His research examines concepts around sustainability, governance, and resiliency. Leith is attempting to gain a better understanding of the dynamics associated with municipal, rural, and remote economies, specifically resource-based economies across Canada. What are their experiences, and why are some communities able to grow and prosper while others experience decline? Leith employs a planning lens to frame the project. What can planners do, and what can municipal planning departments do to increase the resiliency and /or sustainability of these communities? We also have beside him Cassandra Bryant, a Rural Studies PhD student at the University of Guelph. So Cassandra has worked in the nonprofit industry for close to 20 years as a consultant in strategic planning, communication, and fundraising. She returned to academia to pursue her doctoral studies with research interests in women-led rural social enterprise, community development, and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the health and wellness of the rural labor market, specifically rural healthcare workers. Cassandra is the chair of the board of Canadian Centre for Rural Creativity, has recently become a research chair on the rural healthcare workforce at Gateway, and runs a voluntary community group called the Changeant Circle that brings together climate change experts and community to encourage awareness, education, and action towards climate change. I would just like to say we couldn't have got through the Be Well Work Well project without these two, so we really appreciate their expertise in the area of research. So thank you. And then we also have Audrey, who we just heard from, and also Heather. So the first question we want to get from you guys is just, we want you to tell us a little bit about yourselves and how you're present in your own community, and just what role community plays in your own life and what it means to you. And we don't care what order you go in, so whoever wants to go first can go ahead.
I have the microphone, so I will begin. So I guess when we look at community, I thought we had a really great discussion this morning about what does community mean. When I think of community, I think about engaging communities and what do engaging communities do. And for me, that's really about working towards a common goal or a common state, that support piece. We think about our family, our friends, our neighbors, but we also think about those or work with those that have common interests to try to make that community thrive. So that's one of the things when I think about community. I have many different communities that I belong to, and they all work towards something different or do something or fulfill me in certain ways in that. So one of the things that Grace had mentioned is the Changeant Circle. So before I started doing that, which was just a couple of years ago, which is about just bringing together experts in climate with community, because so many community members know that we have climate crisis, but they don't really know where to start or where to begin. They're overwhelmed. They're almost paralyzed by fear about what do I do about it. So one of the things that I'm doing, and this is purely voluntary, I work with somebody, a good friend of mine, we work together on this, so we collaborate on this, but we just try to bring together people who are kind of in the know to share information about it in kind of in a way that it's a conversation and people can learn. And then also, it's not about just learning about the topic, but it's also, okay, what can I do? So if you're ready to do like a baby step towards something, there's an opportunity to do that. If you want to kind of dive in, they provide action steps for that. So it's important for myself to feel like I'm working on these bigger tasks within my community, but it's done locally. Prior to that, I also did, again, voluntary, and in the community was a women's wellness circle. And it was, again, bringing together people who were in the modalities of health, wellness, and art. And it was inviting women to come once a month to learn about something new, whether it was for healing, whether it was for creative output, artistry, and just even coming together in community. But it was kind of providing that space. And one of the goals for that circle was just that even if there was one woman who came that loved what we did that night, it could have been drumming, it could have been drawing, it could have been a discussion on the love languages, it could have been whatever it was, but our hope was that somebody would leave that circle and maybe pursue that modality just to help them with themselves and then work in the community. So those are just some of the things for myself when I think about my family and friends and the support that we provide to one another, but also what else am I doing locally to kind of work on these kind of bigger issues at hand.
How am I in community? I'm all in. That's me. I jump in with 2 feet, and in my community right now, I'm starting to do this very work in my own community. So I'm doing it professionally, and I'm also doing it personally, and it is scary. I did a call out and said, if you love Burford just as much as I do, join me on such and such day. I had to take the day off because it was scary. Is anyone going to show? Do people actually love Burford? Do they like it? Am I one of those people that people don't want to be around? Just going back to there, right? And to my surprise, 40 people showed up. And it was just so heartwarming to know that I'm not alone. And so you're not alone in this journey. And it's about looking under things and finding things and ask questions and just constantly, being a detective, because you find these people who will eventually join you on your journey. And so being all in, and also I worry about the civic involvement in community. And the reason why community is changing is because we're not involved anymore. And so I want to be an example to my children, to be all in and to love your community and get involved. And they roll their eyes and they're like, again, Mom, I got to come. And I'm like, yes. But I know deep down that I'm instilling some values in them so that even in our own little family circle, we're going to make some change to the future. And so doing this personally has actually changed me professionally. And so when I go into communities as an outsider, I have some more empathy. And I understand that it is scary, scary work. And it doesn't go the way it's planned. And you take 10 steps forwards and 5 steps backwards. But it's that one person that says, I get it. And I'm going to join you. And so it's a slow journey. So that is my inspiration and how I am in community and a little bit more in depth about my personal and professional.
So as mentioned, my name is Leith Deacon. I'm born and raised in Northern Ontario. I'm from a small town called Corbeil. It has a general store, and I now live in Fergus, another rural community. Yeah, I'm an associate professor. I'm a coordinator for a PhD program. However, I would guess most of the people who actually know me would be surprised if I used any of those words to describe myself. Most people who would know me would say, "You're a bit of a goof. You do not take anything seriously, especially my privilege." And I'm super aware of the privilege that I have, especially by being an overeducated white guy. I get that. But that's simply not who I am. I'm game for fun, playing sports, running, skiing, whatever outside. I'm super impatient. I'm pretty demanding. I'm pretty nice, but I do expect a lot from the people who I work with and who I know. While I don't necessarily care about my professional background, as I said, I'm super aware of the position of privilege it puts me within my own community and with my daily life. I'd also like to mention, and I think some people would agree, I'm keenly aware that when I come into a rural community especially, and I despise being introduced with a PhD because it isn't a welcome. It doesn't say, hey, come talk to me. It says, I am so different than you are, and I'm a bit of a jerk. And so I really try never to have my title, and I was told once, make sure when you fly to have your credentials on. And God, no, why would anybody ever want to do that? So I do play it down typically when I am out in my normal life, because I just don't think it matters that much. In Fergus, in that community, the question is, how do you fit within your community? And the big question here is, what community are you talking about? And in Fergus, I only have lived there for a few years. My wife and my family moved there. We live on Wellington Street. COVID hit, so I literally don't know anybody. I don't know a soul in my home community, and I don't think that matters. And we had this conversation at that table because I realized that I know my direct neighbors, but I don't think that necessarily means I am or am not a member of that community. There's a lot of communities you can be part of, and just simply because you might not know your neighbors doesn't mean you're not contributing. And so, sure, one day I would love to be a member of the Fergus community that people are like, hey, Leith, how you doing? I'm not that guy yet, but maybe one day I'll be there. But it's really hard to become that guy, especially when you're not from the community. You might not have the right last name, or God forbid you live in an agricultural community and you've never been in a barn. And that's me, you know, and I introduce myself as that a lot. I'm a rural-based individual who up until really recently had never been in a barn, and that doesn't make me any less rural than the farmer. And I think that's really important. In my professional community, I do all the stuff I'm supposed to do. I publish, I work, I do all that stuff that, you know, it checks my essential professional boxes. But perhaps within the rural community, I work by using my credentials to help design projects. I help to ensure the voices of rural individuals are heard. There was a question about how do you get people to participate, and that was asked to you. And I think the first thing you have to do is figure out what they want. Ask them physically, what is it that you need? What can I help you with? And I can design you a survey or do some interviews for you, but until I get your trust to say, okay, he's here for us, no one's gonna do it. So I'm that guy. I'm not just a rural guy though, and I think that's such an artificial parameter that you can put on yourself. Don't negate the role that urban communities can play, because, you know, we're all part of the same team, really, right? So I'm just a guy that works in rural communities. I like doing it very, very much, but it's not just that black and white either. You can be a lot of different things.
Thanks, Lee. I think you probably heard enough from me already. I'll give a really short answer. I've had a pretty complicated relationship with community, and it probably comes from where I grew up and then where I live now, and my husband. So there's three parts to the story. So I grew up somewhere where you got home, you locked the door, you didn't talk to anybody. So that was just kind of how things were in my community, because there were safety issues, and we were newcomers to the community. We were newcomers. My parents were newcomers to Canada. So it was a really different kind of view. So I would say at that point in my life, I didn't have a sense of community. And then the middle part of the story, where my husband comes into play, we met at university. Can't believe I'm telling this story. Why not? So we went to visit his parents, and they live in Wheatley, Ontario, a little town. It's had a huge number of problems. They had a massive gas leak and explosion. It's been a really, really tough time. But I remember going to his parents' house, and the neighbors walked in, and I was like, what is happening? I did not know about this. People just, and you can all laugh, but I hadn't seen this, right? So this was big for me. People walked in and they just sat at the kitchen table and they had coffee. And I was like, okay, this is okay. And then we talked about it afterwards, and he said, well, it's just, we leave the keys in the car. The neighbors are in and out. The house is never locked. And you remember, I grew up with the door always locked, right? So this was a big mindset shift for me. And then when we moved to Toronto after university, my husband really missed gardening. So he went and got one of those plots in High Park, because we live close to High Park. And because he's from Wheatley, he grows a lot of tomatoes. So he planted 40 tomato plants. And I don't know if you know how much yield you get from 40 tomato plants. It is significant. And we were 2 humans at the time. We didn't have kids yet. So he met all the neighbors at these community plots. And I was like, what are we going to do with these tomatoes? And this is where my relationship with community started. So come, what was it, August, you get your tomatoes and basil. And he went and hung a little plastic bag of tomatoes and herbs on all of our neighbors' doors. And then they all came to our house. And I was like, what is happening? Anyway, so you see I have a complex relationship, and I've changed. I mean, that was when we were in our 20s. So I learned about community through other people because I wasn't raised with that sense of community. And I raise it because I think it's important to know that people come at community from really different places. And I think the other thing to talk about, and as we moved to Guelph, I got super involved in so many different ways with community, and it does, it takes a lot of your time. And one of the things I wanted to say to this room also is to be respectful of yourself in that process too, because my guess is that a lot of you probably feel like a lot of burnout related to your community work that you do on a regular basis. If you're involved in many initiatives, it's often, I'm looking at Heather here, because once you're the busy person, but it gets complicated, and you often get asked to do other things, and it's the ask the busy person. So I think we have to be really respectful of people and the time that they spend in community, because they can also feel really burned out, and people need opportunities to recharge. So those are maybe a little bit of different comments. So I have a very complicated relationship. And now, I'm involved in so many fun things, and I feel really privileged to get to do that. I get to work doing community-based research. Because I've been so inspired by the work we've been doing in Prince Edward County, we've actually started up a new group in Guelph where we're trying to deal with, I was talking to, I think it was Shannon earlier, about how every organization sort of has their own mandate. And what we're trying to do is to find 2 or 3 things across mandates with different organizations where we have shared goals so that we can pull people together around common vision. And we're trying to fill kind of that middle space that nobody's filling around complex issues. So we're trying out some new stuff right now, and it's very much in its infancy, and that's where I'm spending some of my time.
We're going to have to bring you, and we have to turn on the microphone. I don't think it's working. Oh, is that working? There we go. We're going to definitely have to engage you, Audrey, because you have so much free time. But I was thinking there's just so many areas that we could use your expertise and experiences. Okay, so I get the second question, and it's what changes have you noticed in community? Now, I know we've kind of touched on this already, but, shamelessly, this is where you'll get to hear a little bit more about Be Well, Work Well and some of the work that Heather and Audrey have been doing in their communities.
So one of the things when we're looking at Be Well, Work Well, and I'm not sure about are we sending out or sharing that information package? Yeah?
Be on the table
Perfect.
during the afternoon,
Okay.
And then we'll be putting them up on our website.
Perfect. Yeah. So one of the things that we took a look at with the Be Well, Work Well is really the impacts of the pandemic on the labor market, and really focused on mental health and wellness. And so when we're talking about changes in community right now, I'll be speaking to the rural healthcare sector. Not only have I done research with this project and this team, also with Gateway, we specifically looked at the healthcare sector, rural healthcare sector in Huron at the beginning of the pandemic. So we actually surveyed back in June 2020, and then we did follow-up interviews and group discussions this year. So the reason why I'm sharing that is because we're thankfully getting a little bit of a timeline in terms of how the healthcare workforce is doing. Mental health and wellness is obviously one of the things that we're taking a look at. In this package that you'll be getting this afternoon, we were able to list all of the definitions of what mental health means to the participants in the Be Well Work Well study. I think you'll find it really interesting to see what people say. But when we look at the mental health and wellness, a lot of people did share it's the ability to cope, ability to, when you step outside the door, that you can handle the interactions that you're having, you can handle your work, you can handle your family and do that. But it was also interesting to hear some individuals share about that it's not just about ability to cope, but the ability to flourish. And that really talks about mental wellness as opposed to just when we think about mental health. And when we think about mental health, we think about the problems that we're having as opposed to the positives and what that means to have mental wellness. So I just wanted to preface that with some of the changes in community. And again, I'm looking at the healthcare community. And I'll share a little story that was from one of the interviews that I had. It was with a nurse who was a full-time nurse. We got on the phone or on Zoom, and basically as soon as the call started, her phone rang, and she goes, "Just one moment." And I said, "No problem." She picked up the phone, and she did not mute herself, so I did hear the conversation, but she was basically trying to help and calm down one of her healthcare workers, one of her fellow nurses who was having a really difficult time. And so she's like, "I'll call you as soon as I'm done speaking to Cassandra, and we'll have a conversation." And when she got off the phone with her friend, I said, "Do you need to go and help your friend? Because we can reschedule. I'm totally fine with that." She said, "It's okay. I've been on the phone with her for 3 hours already. I'm going to talk to her afterwards, but this is one of my colleagues in the workplace. And there's a bunch of us right now. We're just on the phone, just trying to help each other." And so that happened, and I thought, this is incredible for me to be witnessing this, kind of in action, the stresses and the things that are happening for healthcare workers. And then as we were talking, she is a nurse, and I'm saying she was a nurse. She had planned to do nursing for her whole career. She was in her mid-30s. She was going to be, and anyone who's familiar with healthcare workers and nurses, they call themselves lifers if this is going to be your profession. My goal was to become a lifer. I'm starting part-time, doing casual, but I want to be full-time and I want to be a lifer. And so we were talking, and then pretty much after she shared that, she let me know that she had quit her job the week before and got a new job, not nursing. And she was working in a position also that she said she would not have qualified for pre-pandemic. So there's a whole bunch of different things in that scenario there. Number one, the labor shortage that we know just watching the news, listening to the news, that this is at crisis level. We know that the healthcare sector is destabilizing, and that's a real concern. But here it really does show the scenario here where you had someone who this was going to be their job. They were passionate about it. And as I was speaking to her, she was 3 days in, I think, to her new job there. Then there was the fact that there is that burnout, the stress, and the challenges that they're feeling. And then highlighting the importance of informal support, friends, families, and neighbors. And what's been interesting, and one of the changes, I think, not just in the healthcare sector, but in all sectors, is that this reliance on colleagues, these informal supports that are there with colleagues, has actually increased, because you don't want to take your troubles home and keep talking to your partner, your family, your kids about your problems, but you can talk to your colleagues, and your colleagues understand. So that was just something that I think is really poignant example of what's happening. And just very quickly, and I'll pass it on, but just knowing too, in the healthcare sector, while it's been difficult in 2020 and 2021, we know the fallout is happening in 2022. There were studies in early 2000s talking about the nursing shortage that was going to be happening in 10 to 15 years. Here we are 10, 15, 20 years later, and we did not factor in the pandemic. So it just kind of really exacerbates it. The other thing too, and this is really for everyone, but in healthcare, the analogy that I'm using in both studies is when the pandemic hit in healthcare, it was a sprint. So it was all hands on deck. Let's everyone help. Let's figure it out. But now we are in a marathon, because the pandemic, as we know, is not over. We're not sitting here post-pandemic looking at what we can do and how we move forward. It really is about a marathon that the healthcare workers are in, and it's a marathon that does not have a finish line, and it's a marathon that no one received training for. So you can just picture the level of exhaustion there. And There's a couple more, but I think what I'll just touch upon, we talk about our healthcare sector, that they're heroes and that they're angels in training, but also the fact that they have received a lot of frustrations, resentment, a lot of challenges from from patients, but also patients' family members, and just feeling that they're kind of getting assaulted, if you will. So there's a bit of resentment growing around that hero terminology and that angels in training, also because they cannot keep it up. So the amount of guilt that they have and not continuing to be a hero is something that's weighing on them. And the last thing I'll just share too is that because they are carers, there is a lot of guilt in wanting to seek support for themselves. Carers should not be seeking care, basically. I'm the one who's supposed to be caring, so I need to be on. So that's something I think that's really interesting. It's a change. It's coming out of the study, but I think it's something we have to take a look at because we do need to support our carers. Everyone needs to support, but we do definitely need that support there. And I think the last piece is just knowing vulnerable people are serving vulnerable people. So just that compassion piece. Yeah, so I'll leave it there. Sorry if that was too long.
I'm just going to add a positive spin to what we've been hearing and seeing from COVID, is that people, the residents, us as humans, were able to pivot and care for each other faster than any organization or institution could. The caremongering, that new terminology I never heard of, popped up, in that we came together and we helped each other. We found out who were the ones that were recluse and couldn't go out into the community. We did the shopping for them. We knocked on doors and, do you need help? That natural caring came to light that didn't really show up before COVID. And so that is a positive. And going forward in the future, how do we build on that? How do we learn from that? How do we not put all our eggs in one basket in terms of our organizations and institutions, but understand that we all have a role, and what is that role, and how do we work together to build our future? Because we know that we're going to have another crisis coming forward. We know that there are climate issues coming forward. There's fires, there's earthquakes. There's a lot that we can learn from those emergencies and how we react as a community and residents to be able to build a plan going forward.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with a terrible saying that I heard on the radio. Don't let a good pandemic go to waste. I know that comes off as both terse and sarcastic, but it actually does make a pretty good point. COVID's been a massive disruption, unlike any other disruption that we've ever faced previously. With this disruption came terrible challenges. First and foremost, we lost lives. Within and across rural communities, but across society more broadly, we had challenges around concepts like isolation, retirement home residents. We all know those stories. But also within and across rural spaces more specifically. Many businesses, on an economic standpoint, experienced insurmountable challenges, and while the government, both federal and provincial, offered support, they often did not reflect the challenges and realities that rural business owners, including farmers, faced. Lastly, we saw challenges that roughly could be summed or should be summed up as mental health challenges. Now, again, these challenges had negatives, but I'd rather try to put a potential positive spin on this, and the positive spin rather is opportunity. Mental health has been a topic that has struggled to gain traction across the public discourse. We've all read the obituary that says John died suddenly. We carry tremendous shame around suicide. It's just, we have for a long time. Mental health has been a topic that has struggled to gain this traction, and we have always had small, quiet conversations about mental health. But generally, these were on a case-by-case basis, and quite often, and more accurately, they were about mental illness. COVID-19 exacerbated all of our mental health concerns, many of which have been discussed already. We had increased alcohol consumption, cannabis usage, domestic abuse, and those things are terrible challenges, and they cannot and should not be ignored. But the other thing that COVID has done was act as a catalyst to minimize the stigmatization around mental health. As many of you know, in addition to the Be Well Work Well project, I have run a very large project that has been focused on attempting to understand the experiences of rural residents within the context of COVID. We ended up collecting over 25,000 surveys that did a number of things, but first it highlighted that there is a hunger across rural communities to be heard. We've been systematically and systemically ignored for too long by all levels of government who are responsible for policy and program development. Second, it really highlighted how cohorts within rural spaces have been impacted by the pandemic, and critically, the differences within and across cohorts. I know that I'm speaking to the choir here, but that's right, rural is not a group of middle-aged white guys. Whoops. There is a myriad of interests that are present within rural spaces. And third, COVID has pushed this discussion around mental health, in particular for self-identifying males within rural spaces. As I've mentioned, suicide is the leading cause of death for males in rural spaces. This isn't new, but what is new is there's now a conversation starting. Not only what can we do, but interestingly, there is a conversation led by males saying, I need help and that's okay. So the question is, what changes have I noticed in my community? That's what we were asked to discuss. And I would call this my rural community in this context. I would say there's now more empathy around the experience of people in rural spaces who are experiencing mental health challenges. There's an opportunity for all of us to push for additional services that are reflective of the rural spaces we find ourselves in. I also would say that in many instances, we are more compassionate. So going back to my first statement in the response, don't let a good pandemic go to waste. Let's continue to push this conversation. Let's continue to decrease stigmatization around mental health concerns, particularly for males, but for all residents around mental health. And let's advocate for appropriate and accessible services that reflect the realities that we find ourselves in.
Well said. Thank you. Probably, I'll just give a short answer. I think one of the biggest changes, I think if anyone had said to us in March 2020, you're going to be home for almost 2 years, I don't think any of us would have believed it. I think we paced our, because you'd have to pace yourself almost like a marathon pace, right? You would think about so many things. So I think the change that I saw is that we became incrementalists at that time. So we all learned to do things in short bites, because they'd say, okay, it's 2 more weeks. And we go, okay, I can do 2 more weeks. Okay, it's another month. Okay, and then the vaccine's coming. And then, so we all kind of became, at least this is what the change I saw in people around me, is we all kind of became good at sort of adjusting to emerging conditions in a way that I didn't think was really possible. Because if you told me I had to do that for 2 years, I would have said there's no way. Think about the things that we did. Think about lining up at the grocery store. If somebody told me I was going to line up at the grocery store with a mask on, I probably wouldn't have believed you, or I would have found it extremely shocking. So I think what we learned was that we have these reserves that we didn't even know we had. I had no idea the things that we could do, right? I don't think any of us did. And so I think the takeaway from that for me is that people are highly adaptable and more adaptable than we ever could have realized. And I think we need to harness that. And I put up those funny slides with, the chalk marks in the park and, some of the ways that we learned how to be together, because I think there's a creativity within that we can harness now within communities, and we can ask people to do things that maybe they didn't think were possible, because we've all just proven we can do something that we never would have thought was possible. So I think that's the hope I have for communities right now, is that we can harness some of that, I don't know, you can call it entrepreneurial thinking, creative thinking, just new ways of doing things that really helped us just become more resilient with our own families and then within our neighborhoods, because we really thought locally at that time, and there were so many good movements that came out. So I think that's my positive spin on and hope for community coming out of this.
Going back to the question about different ways of engaging community and creativity. So what over the last 2 years working across Canada is that we realized that the way we are engaging our communities sucked. And there was such innovative ways of getting out into the community other than just surveys and these boring meetings. There was one group in St. Albert, Alberta, who, just as COVID hit, they were ready to do their big engagement on a big plan. So they got 99-cent Bristol board, $1 marker, and they went to the parks where these circles were, and they held up the Bristol board, and people yelled their answer. And they got a massive amount of response, right? It also brought us down to that super hyper local level. We're so used to, biggest bang for our buck. One meeting, 100 people, let's get them all together. This switched it to more of that trust and relationship building, 100 cups of coffee. So they also realized that we were so used to people coming to us. We planned these big things and expected people to come to us to engage. COVID made us go to them and do that smaller thing. So I think it also pushed us out of our comfort zone as community people doing engagement to really think outside the box and do things differently.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for providing that insight and hope into, the changes that have gone on over the last few years. I think we really need to hear that. And given this is a Now What panel, the next question we have is, how do we approach these changes and move forward and translate these into positive actions in the future? So really taking that asset-based community development approach and taking the positive perspective to do something with these changes that can better our communities and economies.
Me? Oh gosh. Okay. How do we take these? I think we need to talk to each other. And one of the things I think we need to get better at is looking for similarities instead of differences. So many of our organizations have mandates that have overlap within them, and we all have mandates and we all have responsibilities. And I think looking for commonalities instead of differences is probably one of the first steps we can begin to take. And then within that, realizing that it takes many hands to do this work and to create change. And I think sometimes it's bringing that idea of creative problem solving into community discussions and economic priorities. So I think we need to get better at connecting and talking with one another, sharing where we have limitations on things and where we need help from other people. And it's not easy. And I think, if you work for a big business or a municipality, there's a lot of, there are power structures that we have to think about within those too. And so how do those big organizations work with communities and bring other voices to the table? So I think we have huge opportunities ahead of us, and it takes everybody coming together to really look at finding a new way forward. I don't know who wants to go next.
Yeah, I'll build on that. I think when you're talking about the networking and making those connections and having conversations, I think for such a long time, it was, you talked about let's find the similarities as opposed to the differences. It's that competitive mindset versus that collaborative mindset. And so one of the things that we talk about as organizations or community groups, even as individuals, what's your unique value proposition? How are you different from everyone else? And whereas we can, I think, turn that around and say, where are the similarities and where can we collaborate? I think about the one organization that I do volunteer for, the Canadian Centre for Rural Creativity. One of its mandates is to create connections and conversations and networks that where they did not exist before. So it's uncharted territory, and we're willing to have those conversations. And it's really big on also bringing together artists and creatives with business or academia, because we do need to look and see things differently and just be different in how we kind of approach. So I do appreciate that, and I think it is that collaborative spirit. And for me, it's always about curiosity. So coming in, and when I have an opportunity to speak to somebody or a group, I'm in curiosity mode. I want to learn. So it's me asking questions and trying to understand better, as opposed to me coming in and saying, this is what I know, in that sense. So I appreciate that. And I think you talked about that earlier when you said, here are the results or the findings. Did we get it right? Just to be able to have that engagement piece.
I'm going to go back to what you were saying. We need to become rowers. And I think we all need to jump into a rowboat together, or to a big, what are the big rowing boats? Because if you, the dragon boat things. Because if you think about it, there are, everybody in that boat is just as important to move that boat. And they all have roles. Like the person who's not rowing and yelling rowing, they have a role. And the people who are rowing have a role too. And if we row together in sync, we're gonna get to the finish line. But we all need to know where that finish line is, right? So we need to find that finish line, and we need to become rowers, which leads to the functions. All of us have a function as businesses, as organizations and institutions and volunteers. And I call it the 3-lane highway, and today I changed it to 4-lane highway. So my 3-lane highway there's a lane for people, the residents, the citizens, and they have a function in community. There's a lane for our volunteers and our associations and our groups, and they have a function. And then there's a lane for institutions and government. The 4th lane is business. So I'm going to pull that out because it wasn't really in that conversation. And what we need to do is we need to figure out what is our role and our function in community. And then we need to respectively put our indicators on and go into another lane, into our association's lane or our government lane, do what we need to do, but put our indicator and go back to our own lane. That's what I think is happening in community right now, is that organizations and governments have taken over, and we're going to do for you, and we've got the solutions and the jobs, we know what to do. We're the experts. But I think what we need to do is we need to sort ourselves. We need to get into a rowboat. We all need to get our own oars, but we need to row together.
I'm super jealous of people who don't take notes and don't have notes when they talk.
Make us feel unprepared.
I know, I was like, I'm so unprepared.
I can't do it. Anyway, so I'm going to go back to my notes. Yesterday, I think some of you know, I was up in North Bay running a panel, and I'm super happy to say that these conversations are happening in other places. And so my answer to how do we approach them and move forward is going to be stolen from the panel, I think, essentially. So I've kind of broken it down into like 5 ways that I think we, as whatever it is that we are, can move forward. And I think, which is maybe in a little bit of opposition of what was just said, but yet the same, is flexibility. And people talk about thinking outside of the box, but I would actually go a little bit further and say just break down the box altogether. We need to start to consider response plans that are non-traditional and inclusive and flexible in terms of the goals and the objectives, but also what we can or cannot do. We need to be pretty honest with ourselves. We tend to silo ourselves in our response to disruption. As you work for ECDEV, I work in public health, and that's it. I think a lot of people who do this type of work argue that these are artificial titles. They're artificial roles, and in fact what we're doing is holding innovative responses back, especially within and across rural communities that tend to be small. We all know that rural communities are resource tight. We're often underfunded, we're always underserved, and our position is always minimized. By sticking with strict parameters around who does what, or who is responsible for what, or this or that, all we're doing is just continuing in those roles. Related to that, conversations about who needs or who deserves that need they need to be reconsidered. By continuing to work with artificial boundaries or definitions, we're perpetualizing and continuing the challenges or limitations that we have been experiencing. The second would be equity. This one's much shorter, so don't worry. We all know individuals or groups who are neglected, and we need to work to ensure that all voices are heard and given appropriate consideration. If there's a group who is systematically or systemically neglected, reach out and lift them up. So I'm not talking about equality because that won't work. I'm talking about equity. We're only as good as we all are, which gets back to your canoe boat example. Equitable, inclusionary practices are critical to approaching the challenges we face. The third is cooperation, and this is where we probably don't do the world's best job. Similar to the flexibility point, collaborate, cooperate, not just within your community, but across rural spaces. Rural spaces are unique and they're different, but they're not snowflakes. The plight of rural communities is something that is shared across rural spaces. We have strength in numbers. Perhaps if you're from Perth County, maybe there's someone in Wellington County that does something you could ask. Perth and Huron have an excellent relationship, but maybe it's time to expand that relationship a little bit more obviously. The fourth is adaptation. This is something that I see at work and something that gives me super great hope. Generations in school now, university is where I work, obviously, they're adaptable, they hustle. They also demand inclusivity, not just tokenism, but true representation. They cry and they think it's okay, and that's the thing, it is okay. My sister is an elementary school teacher, and she gets a much different perspective, inclusivity around ethnicity or gender, our ongoing conversations around pronouns. Their generation doesn't care. So I think that adaptation is perhaps the right word, but maybe it's just evolution. We're evolving, and as adults sitting here in this room, we struggle to recognize the beauty and the strength of evolution often. And the last one is advocating, and this is my last point, I promise. We have to sell rural. We don't have the political seats that matter in the eyes of Toronto or in Ottawa, but yeah, we're all providers. That's the reality. That's what rural communities are. We provide extractive resources, minerals, lumber, oil and gas, and of course, food is the easy one to sell. Nearly every single person in Toronto ate something this morning, and you know what? All of that food was from a rural space. We need to sell why we matter. We provide for Ontario, we provide for Canada, and this provision is not economic, it's day-to-day existence, it's survival. Ontario rural spaces, including critically Northern Ontario, is more than just a place for urban residents to come and vacation and visit. We live here, we raise our families here, we work here, and we need to stop being polite about it. We need to force for inclusion of rural considerations, not one rural voice, but true, honest rural representation. This is the most critical component of how we approach the challenges we face and that we continue to face, and we'll be able to move forward by doing that. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm whispering to Grace going, okay, you know what? Wasn't that an amazing panel? Thank you so I don't know how we got quite so lucky to have such great people to share their wisdom and insights with us. But we were going to do questions, but we're out of time. So I'm going to thank the panel. Thank you so much. You'll have an opportunity, I hope, during lunch to get to know our panelists and to ask any of those questions, those burning questions you might have. So thanks. Now get out of here. And I'm just like, thank you so much. Thank you.